Good afternoon, colleagues here from Glasgow. I was about to say Songdo. This is not Songdo. This is Glasgow, Scotland. Good afternoon, colleagues from Scotland. We're starting the event, the Pavilion event, on evaluating climate change adaptation and climate actions, particularly focusing on the small island developing states and the LDCs, the least developed countries. It's been a long 2 weeks. We have a very small audience that in the room, hopefully many online watching. So because we're so small and intimate, perhaps we can go around, do an introduction with the audience before we do the introductions with the panel members. And Andres is going to come around and pass the mic to you. For those of you in the audience, you might need to put your headphones on, otherwise you won't be able to hear us. Now you can. Andres, do you want to?
Okay, over to our people in the front row. Thank you for coming. Just a quick introduction of who you are, maybe a little bit of, very, very brief, just if you're from an NGO, think tank, government agency, or so on and so forth, just that we have a little bit of an understanding who's here. Over to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Amber. I work with the Center for Environmental Peace Building, which is an NGO. We support climate change adaptation and mitigation work in particularly at-risk areas. So this is a very exciting event, and we're especially excited to learn about subnational governments and groups accessing climate finance resources for adaptation and kind of how they go about those processes. So very excited to be here today.
I'm Paul Weaver. I also work for the Center for Environmental Peace Building. Very happy to learn the same things Amber just said. So.
Thanks, Amber. Thanks, Paul. I go over to here. Just a brief introduction on who you are, what you're working on.
Good afternoon. My name is Lucy Kagendo Mbai. I come from Kenya. I work for Green Dimensions Network, which is an NGO in Kenya that is working with advocacy, mitigation, and adaptation in Kenya. And I'm here actually to learn more and just to see what Korea is doing. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Come over to you. Hello. From Nicaragua. Ooh, wonderful.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I am Javier Gutierrez from Nicaragua. I am Secretary of Climate Change for Presidents. I have delegation also. My colleagues not speak very well the English, but this is especially in finance, and climate change and finance. This is a Minister on Finance from Nicaragua also. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. We're very privileged to have you then here today, and we're really happy to have you here today. And as Archie said, we're going to talk a little bit about climate finance from the global perspective, from the Green Climate Fund, who is headquartered in Songdo, South Korea, as of now. So back to you, Archie.
Thank you, Andres, for passing the mic around for the introductions to the audience members. Colleagues, we have a very exciting set of speakers today before us, a mix of evaluators, scientists, and bringing to you the latest that we know from our respective institutions about adaptation, what works, what doesn't work, and for whom, and by how much. We're also, because we're such a small group, hopefully we'll be able to learn from the practitioners as well, because the audience is mostly practitioners and others interested in adaptation. So we'll be able to have an exchange about what we know so far, and probably reflecting on the conversations we've had in other rooms in the 2 weeks we've been here, and what we might look to after the conclusion of this conference. So we have a very exciting group of panelists who we'll hear from first, and presentations first, and then we'll get into the audience questions and discussions. Please feel free to share your reflections as well, not just questions for the audience, for the panelists, but also the things that you might know and the lessons that the rich lessons that you bring through your own practice and your work. Our first speaker today is Alexandra Conietta. She's an evaluator at DVAL. She's been based there since September 2018, so a little bit over 2 years. And before that, she worked as advisor on that's my Korean phone calling me, as they do in Korea, ecosystem-based adaptation at the GIZ, and she's also been at the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. Before that, she was being based at the BMZ and as well as the Center for European Economic Research. Alexandra is going to tell us a little bit about the work that she's been doing and she's been involved with over the last couple of years, on particularly looking at an evidence gap map on adaptation. That will tell us from the scientific literature as to what we know, what we don't know, and what gaps there are. Alexandra, take us away. What do we know, what do we not know?
Hey, thank you very much for this kind introduction, Archie, and also for organizing this wonderful session. Just for you as a background, DEVAL is the German Institute for Development Evaluation, an independent and public institute with a mandate to undertake evaluations at a very strategic level of German ODA. And 3 years ago, we kickstarted a very comprehensive and modular evaluation on climate change adaptation in German development cooperation, which is still running for another year, but we will see some of the results which are already published and some key learnings here. So having said this, in general, we find that evidence is often scattered across many different sources, maybe journals, web pages, etc. And starting the adaptation evaluation in 2018, we noticed that there is a lack of accessible, comprehensive, and systematic synthesis of evidence on the effectiveness of climate change adaptation. So we don't really have a good overview of what is out there. To inform evaluations, but also policy making and further research, an evidence gap map on climate change adaptation in low and middle income countries was elaborated in collaboration with the IEU of the GCF. And the research question was, what is the state of evidence base regarding the ability of adaptation interventions to help people in developing countries adapt to the impacts of climate change? So we really have the focus on development, on the development space here. The EGM implements a conceptual framework based on the IPCC's assessment report 4.5, which we will see in the next slide. And in the next step, it searches literature using a specified protocol. It looks for studies which use quantitative and mixed method evidence, for example, impact evaluations, systematic reviews, and correlation analysis. And this might also be a limitation. Qualitative information, for example, was not considered since it's a bit more tricky to include it. According to our mandates, we filtered for evidence in low and middle income countries as defined by the ODA recipient list that makes about 156, I think, countries. And also we limited ourselves, given our resources, to English, to studies written in English, or studies in French, Spanish, German, but with an English abstract. And publications are included from 2007 to 2018, since we started then our work. As said, given on the next slide, Archie, please. Yeah. As said, given that adaptation is a very broad topic, we needed to classify the different sectors, types of intervention, and the variety of outcomes. And within the framework that was elaborated, that EGM on climate change adaptation is able to present where the adaptation approaches from the perspective of interventions, defined as you can see on the left side, and outcome groups defined as you can see above. The evidence is also framed around key adaptation sectors, which you can see below, which is water, forestry, fishery and agriculture, and so on. And we also have the very broad sector of social, economic and public health considerations. We will see this later on. On the next slide, you can see the results. Following the systematic literature research from around almost 40,000 studies initially found, about 1,000 pieces of evidence collected in roughly 500 studies remained after inclusion and exclusion, and they are, as you can see here, mapped in this framework I just introduced. The EGM highlights that evidence for adaptation in this sector exists, as well as where evidence gaps are found. However, you just can see if there's evidence or not, but you couldn't tell if an intervention was effective, if it was good or not. So this is important to be in mind. In the next slide, we will have a further look on the EGM. In the horizontal line, you see that there is a lot of evidence in the forestry, fishing, and agriculture sector. While still be in mind that the EGM does not indicate if the interventions have been effective or not. It just shows neutrally that we did do a lot of study in these sectors. In the next slide, you can see that there's particular a rich body of evidence when it comes to technological options, including, for example, drought-resilient seeds or irrigation techniques. And this is also logical to us, since those interventions are relatively easy to measure in quantitative studies. And so this is not so surprising. Coming to the next slide. Thank you. We see that there is surprisingly little evidence in the water sector, although this sector is so relevant for CCA in, everywhere, but also in the developing countries we considered. A hypothesis might be that this might be because of the types of studies and we included in the water sector with very huge interventions running for long time horizons tends to have more ex-ante analysis or cost-benefit studies instead of rigorous impact assessments. Coming to the next slide. We see that there are also major evidence gaps targeting, for example, the entire, the enabling sector, and again, this might be due to difficulties to measure this in quantitative studies. Thank you. In summary, the evidence gap maps identifies evidence classes, for example, in agriculture or in nature-based actions, as we saw, and gaps in water and land use, for example, and helps actors understand if they are operating in evidence-rich or evidence-scarce fields. So what about the allocation patterns of Germany's ODA for climate change adaptation? Is there a link between the allocation of adaptation fund and the rigorous scientific evidence on the effectiveness of adaptation? And we undertook an allocation and portfolio analysis, and in this analysis we reviewed the pattern by a macro quantitative allocation analysis using statistical methods. On the next slide, you can see one of the key findings. This would be, for example, one of the key findings shows that the quantity of evidence does not determine sectoral allocation of German ODA. There is no clear link between the allocation of adaptation funds and available rigorous scientific evidence on the effectiveness of the measures. Also, we found in the study that when it comes to different instruments, ODA is not allocated in fields of rich evidence. For example, we do have little studies on the effectiveness of climate risk insurances, but relatively high ODA commitments, and they are still growing in this field. So there is an ambiguous relationship between available evidence and allocation decisions. On the next slide, thank you. We assessed the impact of vulnerability on the probability of receiving German commitments, and however, we see the results that show that the higher the exposure is, the more likely a country is to receive adaptation funding, ceteris paribus. There's also, if there's a lack of adaptive capacity, this increases the probability of receiving funding from Germany. However, we found that the group of SIDS actually benefit below average from German adaptation commitments, and so they are less likely to receive German adaptation commitments, which may be for a number of reasons. In the next slide, you will see a map that shows the regional distribution of adaptation funds in connection with climate vulnerability. All those data are running from 2011 to 2017. The evaluation shows that climate vulnerability significantly increases a country's probability to receive German adaptation finance, and we find that the more vulnerable a country is, the more likely it is to receive funding for adaptation measures. However, and this is another finding, countries that are more vulnerable to climate change do not receive a consistently higher level of commitment, which we would assume. For example, also here we found that the group of small island development states benefits below average from German adaptation commitments. Well, on the next slide, I will leave you with these findings. You can see all the publications available on our webpage deval.org, the evidence gap maps, the portfolio analysis, and further studies we undertook, and we will still be uploading. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Alexandra. Some very interesting findings there in terms of patterns of where evidence is available, where then investments are made, and perhaps there might be a correlation causation there, or there might not be. Let's really quickly turn to the Green Climate Fund, and they've been undertaking, or I also work at that unit, so the independent evaluation unit of the Green Climate Fund has been undertaking over the last 2 years a concerted effort to examine the efficiency and effectiveness of the GCF portfolio in the small island developing states and the LDCs and other groups of vulnerable countries. Let's hear now from our colleague Andres Streumann, the head ad interim of the Independent Evaluation Unit. He's been involved with or led 2 different evaluations on the SIDS, as well as currently leading one on the LDCs, and including an evaluation on the adaptation portfolio of the GCF. Andres, what are we learning? Alexandra spoke to us about the direction and the patterns of ODA, where it goes, where the evidence is available. GCF is a different institution. Is it effective in its portfolio?
Thank you, Archie, and thanks, colleagues, for this lovely chat that we have here today. So, look, from our perspective here at the Green Climate Fund and the Independent Evaluation Unit, we've always looked at the question of mandates and of the Green Climate Fund, and looking at what are we supposed to do as a fund in this space. And what we found is, and it's no great news. We have heard this throughout COP26 this week and last week. What we see is that there is still the aim of the GCF to fill that gap in financing, and in financing in particular in adaptation finance. And we also, through our earlier evaluations, found that there is still this need as well for the GCF to reassess this aim in context of the climate finance and the climate emergency, because we've come to a stage where emergency and climate finance is really crucial to satisfy some of these needs. So I wonder if we could put up the slides. I've just very few slides to illustrate some of the learnings that we have from the adaptation evaluation and evaluating adaptation of the GCF. Next slide, please. And excellent. And so what I wanted to bring to you here is really quickly 4 key aspects that we found were crucial when we think about the adaptation approach of the Green Climate Fund, the largest climate fund as we all know. So, unlike other climate funds, the GCF avoids defining key concepts such as adaptation itself, climate rationale, traditional knowledge, and innovation. And it does so to create more flexibility for the accredited entities, but also for the national designated authorities, to find their way on how their needs can be addressed in their particular context. But however, as it is, when you provide a lot of flexibility, at the same time you have certain consequences that you have to deal with. And the consequences is that this flexibility reduces the precision of how the GCF can handle its policies and approaches and strategies for the stakeholders in the countries that would like to access the fund in an effective and efficient manner. So this is a critical consideration. The GCF has the opportunity to make a considerable impact in adaptation. So we looked at the financial flows to non-OECD countries, and what we found is that when you look at the annual climate finance flows, that the GCF is by far a smaller player in the mitigation space, with only about 0.3% of all the financial flows coming from the Green Climate Fund, versus adaptation, where the Green Climate Fund can have a far larger impact of about 2% of market share. So this is about the role. Coming to the capacity question, in terms of capacity, we found that the GCF has currently no approach to promote efficiency in the coordination at country level. So what we found in developing countries, and in particular in vulnerable countries such as the SIDS and the LDCs, they highlighted in our engagement in the countries high transaction costs in accessing climate finance. And that's that's considered a key challenge, and that's due to the fact that there are large coordination costs in the countries across the different climate finance providers, the climate funds, as well as bilateral donors. So it's very difficult for the country partners to find the adequate partners to address recipient needs, and it requires what we found to be a capacity concern. It requires matchmaking to really truly find the right partners to do this work. Okay. In addition to this, we also looked at the question of access. And here, I really wanted to tell you that the adaptation projects that we've looked at take extremely long to come about at the Green Climate Fund. So from submission of the proposal to the approval of the project, it takes about, on average, 350 days. So that's almost a year, compared to 290 days when you have a mitigation project. But then the journey doesn't stop there. So after projects are approved, you will have to look at the legal arrangements for the projects, and that takes on average another 449 days. So what we found, until the implementation can start. So what we found here is that this trend is even increasing when we look at the current pipeline of adaptation projects that we have in the fund. That means the concept notes that have already been submitted to the fund, and that's quite a concern for us. In addition to this, we've also looked at the question of access from the portfolio perspective that's currently existing. What we found is that only 4 out of 67 are larger programs. The rest are smaller projects, which are mostly grant financed. So we're talking about 96% of all committed finance in pure adaptation project is grant financed. So the private sector is not used effectively. And that most of these projects, the 67 projects, are dominated by international accredited entities. Just to give you again a figure, we are looking at about 6 UN and EU organizations that receive almost 50% of the entire financing of the Green Climate Fund. Okay, and lastly, let me go to measurement. And here, I really would like to hear a little bit from the colleagues on the floor, as well as here in the panel. Another challenge that we found is the measurement of adaptation activities and investments. And this challenge requires a definition of key concepts and traditional knowledge and innovation. As I said to you initially, the GCF has chosen a far more flexible approach to this. But this really presents the GCF with a true difficulty in order to measure and effectively evaluate the performance of the fund. So indeed, at this point, the GCF uses only two concepts. One is the investment criteria to see if the projects are fit for the Green Climate Fund, and then the results management framework with its results areas to discuss the categorization of projects. And that is, from our perspective, not sufficient to actively steer the portfolio towards high impact in adaptation. Okay, I'll stop here with the adaptation parts. I've also got another additional reflections on the SIDS. So just next slide, and next slide again. Thank you very much. So I just wanted to briefly bring to your attention some of the small island development states considerations here. Next slide, please. So what we found here is that indeed for the SIDS, we have a couple of conclusions. So in addition to what we've heard from the adaptation evaluation, for the SIDS it's particularly difficult to address the urgent climate needs through the alternative modalities that the GCF provides, such as the simplified approval process as well as the enhanced direct access. These have huge potential but are not used. Secondly, we also looked at accreditation and the access again, and what we found is that access and accreditation truly disadvantages the small island development states. So for instance, when we looked at national access, it's extremely limited. The GCF really wants to truly look at a country-owned process where we have direct access entities, but unfortunately only 4 out of 40 SIDS have national direct access entities. And that's a concern. When we then look at the regional direct access entities, for most of the SIDS, and they're clearly preferred by the SIDS counterparts, for most of the SIDS, the many regional direct access organizations are truly overwhelmed with the requests for preparatory support programs or the pipeline development for projects. So you look at regional direct access entities that have a far limited number of colleagues, sometimes only 2 to 5 people in the office, and they are getting a request for more than 14 eligible SIDS countries, and that is obviously difficult to shoulder. And then lastly, from the international accredited entities perspective, they are obviously used far more for the immediate access to green climate, the Green Climate Fund's finance. But again, there we see the problem with incentives, because the international accredited entities are facing far higher transaction costs in providing very small projects for the small island development states, and these high transaction costs again are not considered for some of the parts of the GCF. Just the next slide, please. I will just want to highlight again. We see again the same. We see a very interesting finding here in the small island development states. We have a far nicer balance in terms of adaptation and mitigation projects. So that is good, and we're very happy to see that. But there is substantially less co-finance that has been catalyzed in the SIDS. So again, it's this question of the private sector and the private sector involvement. And in addition to this, we also see that the complexion of local private sector in the small island development states is not well understood by the GCF, which brings about these questions about what sort of innovative and flexible approaches in finance we can truly bring to the table. So guarantees and non-debt financial instruments to help the SIDS address their needs. I'll stop here. Thank you very much. I really hope for a very engaged discussion again. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Andreas. Colleagues, and for those of us watching online, the composition of the audience in the room has changed since we started. So right now we have a lot of parties now in the room. I can look at the badges, and the colors tell us that there's a lot of colleagues from representing parties here now in the room. We're discussing the lessons learned through evaluations and through the science on adaptation, focusing particularly on the small island developing states and the LDCs in this session. We've just heard from our colleagues at DVAL and the lessons learned by the Independent Evaluation Unit at the Green Climate Fund through 2 specific evaluations. In addition to the evaluations that Andres just spoke about, the Independent Evaluation Unit is also doing an evaluation of the GCF portfolio in the least developed countries. This evaluation is currently ongoing. But to speak to us about some of the findings and some of the lessons from that evaluation, to give us a sneak peek, is my colleague Victoria Khan. Victoria is an associate data analyst at the Independent Evaluation Unit. She's been with the unit for over 2 years and has participated in a number of evaluations, looking at the policies and portfolios of the GCF. And she'll speak to us a little bit about some of the lessons and some of her favorite messages from the LDC's evaluations emerging so far.
Sure. Thank you very much, Archie. I hope you can hear me well. I'm excited to share a couple takeaways and findings that we had from our ongoing evaluation, which we are preparing for the board submission at the beginning of next year. Yep, sorry, I see the slides are coming up. Yeah. So next slide, please. Yeah, and here I would just like to go a little bit on macro level beyond the GCF level processes and talk a bit how about GCF's likelihood of contributions to system change that lead to paradigm shift in the least developed countries, as this was the part of the assessment of our relevance and effectiveness of the GCF portfolio and approach in the LDCs. Right, so for this analysis, we used the methodology that is based on system modeling, and which is called DEMATEL. This is decision-making trial and evaluation laboratory methodology, which employs mixed methods, starting from available data within the fund, case studies, expert contributions, and of course extensive literature review, that we kicked off this analysis and identified 18 enabling conditions for the systemic change that are relevant to LDCs, and they come from 5 domains, as you can see it on the right-hand side of the slide. The domains are economic and financial, vulnerability to climate change, governance, human institutional, science and technology, and social cultural. So and on the left-hand side, you can see the circle graph that with the black line that shows the relative importance of those enabling conditions for the systemic change in the GCF ecosystem. So those are ranked from the most to the least influential if you go clockwise. Yeah, and the blue line that you can see is overlapping in some parts. This is the current level of Green Climate Fund effort and focus in those respective areas. And our main takeaways from this analysis are that out of 8 most important or influential conditions for systemic change in LDCs, 3 are frequently addressed by the GCF portfolio. So those are presence of collaborative platforms, interministerial and sectoral government collaboration or coordination, and information sharing mechanisms. However, there are 5 rest that are very important and influential but not widely addressed. This is low fragility or conflict, reliable and relevant data systems, civil society engagement in climate action, decentralized institutions, and robust professional civil service core. So in a nutshell, our overarching finding is that yes, GCF is focusing more on the enabling conditions that are directly relevant to climate change. Yeah, which makes sense because this is relevant to the mandate of the GCF. However, there are a lot of other important conditions that are frequently overlooked, but are very important for the long-term sustainability and paradigm-shifting ability of the GCF project outcomes. So our main suggestion is that maybe GCF needs a more comprehensive approach to LDCs and to making systemic change there in those countries. Yeah, thank you very much. Archie, back to you.
Thanks, Victoria. That's very succinct, but it's also very interesting, taken together with the first presentation that Alexandra made about where finance does go and how much we know about those areas, to how much we know about systemic change and where GCF is then investing, and the nature of investments is super interesting. Access is challenging, as Andres told us. Turning very quickly to a different agency completely, to the Asian Development Bank and our colleagues who look at who are coming to us from Manila. Let me introduce to you the director of Independent Evaluation Sector and Project Division at the Independent Evaluation Department of the Asian Development Bank, Mr. Nathan Subramaniam. We also have Garrett Kilroy, and both of them we'll hear first from Garrett. Garrett is a senior evaluation specialist at the same department with more than 20 years of experience. I'll also introduce Nathan at the same time because Nathan will join us more in the discussion. Nathan is the director at the same department, and before taking on that role, he's been involved with the ADB for a very long time. He has degrees from the Booth School and of Business, as well as the IIT in India. And both Nathan and Garrett, for you, the question we'd ask you the question about the lessons that you in your evaluations have found in the various evaluations that you've done on adaptation, particularly as you focus primarily on the Asia Pacific. Are these lessons consistent, or are you finding other lessons as well? What are some of your key takeaways?
Thanks, Archie. So. Hi everyone, greetings from Manila. My name is Garrett Kilroy. I was the team leader for our recent thematic evaluation of ADB support for action on climate change 2011 to 2020. and Nathan was the director overseeing this evaluation. So I'll just run through a few of the slides just to summarize some of the findings relevant to SIDS and LDCs. Just want to thank GCF. We've enjoyed a few events with our colleagues in IEU, but also to thank the Republic of Korea for supporting this event in their pavilion, and we appreciate that. So if you put the next slide on, please, Archie. So in terms of outline, I'll just have a couple of slides on context in terms of where ADB's member countries are relative to SIDS and LDCs, and then also just some points on what the priorities we found for those countries in our region. Then I'll talk about our evaluation findings on ADB's climate strategy and portfolio resulting from that strategy, and some of our findings on performance and results, and then a few of our key takeaways. And actually, I've really enjoyed listening to the previous speakers, and I think quite a few of our findings will resonate. They certainly they resonated with me. So next slide, please. So yeah, this slide is just to position ADB's developing member countries with the UN's definition of LDCs and SIDS. So we operate a three-tier classification system. Groups A, B, and C, and these groups are determined based on two criteria: the gross national income per capita and the credit worthiness of the countries. But the apologies for the three-letter acronyms. They're very familiar to us, but maybe not to others. But the main point to emphasize is that a big chunk of our Group A countries are LDCs and SIDS, but also overall across the three groups, we cover quite a few of LDCs and SIDS. I mentioned Group A because a couple of my slides will highlight that group. We also try to unpack some of our data for LDCs and SIDS just to provide some findings on that. And another important fact about the Group A countries is they're eligible for grant funding through our Asian Development Fund, which I'll also mention. So next slide, please. So yeah, two graphs here, just maybe 2 points to make. This has been made throughout the last 2 weeks, but again, the graph on the left indicates ADB's DMC's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions across the three groups, A, B, and C, and you can see at 0.3%, the contribution from Group A is almost negligible. But these are amongst the most vulnerable countries, and maybe just to flag two of our member countries, the Maldives and the Marshall Islands, so two atoll nations that have average elevation of less than 2 meters. So these really, for them, climate change is an existential threat. The second point to make in terms of context is to do with the capacity and enabling environments currently in place for them to achieve their climate goals and achieve their nationally determined contributions. This graph on the right is building on some analysis done by UNESCAP, where they looked at the enabling factors needed to implement NDCs and plotted a full range of countries across a spectrum from nascent, engaged, capable, up to effective. So we plotted all our member countries on this, and the important finding to make is the countries in the grayed out area are Pacific Island countries, and they're most of them are in the nascent and engaged. So capacity is an issue, and the issues here are things like access to finance, institutional capacity, but also legal frameworks to support their implementation of NDCs. So with that context, I'll move on to some of our findings. So if you can put the next slide up, please. So here, what we did is we looked at ADB's adaptation strategies over the 10-year period, and also the guidance feeding in from those strategies. And what we found is that for adaptation, the focus really is on climate-proofing infrastructure. Also, I mentioned the Asian Development Fund, which supports the Group A countries. it also has been very important in terms of it has a strategic focus on disaster risk reduction and adaptation. And maybe, more unique, we have a whole range of, each country will have, most countries will have a country partnership strategy to drive the development priorities in cooperation with the member country. But in the case of the Pacific, particularly for the 12 of the small island states, we have a Pacific approach, and that also prioritizes action on climate change and disaster risk reduction. Some of the larger countries in the Pacific, like Fiji and Papua New Guinea, would have their own country partnership strategy. The other finding was the country strategies have improved their focus on climate generally and also on adaptation. And this graph here, maybe just to walk you through it, what we did here is we looked at the Group A countries in this case, and looked at the extent to which the country partnership strategies included indicators for adaptation and for mitigation, the extent to which climate was a strategic pillar in the strategy, or whether it was a cross-cutting theme. And the orange bars are the older cohort of strategies approved 2011 to 2015. And the second cohort are the newer strategies approved from 2016 to 2020. And you can see that particularly in the case of adaptation, almost all of the country partnership strategies examined included adaptation indicators in the results framework, and also the strategic focus increased in terms of including climate as a main pillar. Panning out a bit then in terms of ADB's focus overall on adaptation, ADB did set a target for annual adaptation finance of 2 billion by 2020. ADB wasn't able to meet that target, but it did reach a high point of 1.5 billion in 2015. And then finally, an important point, not just for SIDS and LDCs, but for all our member countries, is in 2014, ADB established a climate risk management framework, and that really has been instrumental in mainstreaming and prioritizing adaptation actions, and no more so than in the LDCs and the SIDS, where adaptation is really a priority. We'll move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of the portfolio resulting from those strategies, maybe just to walk you through some of the pie charts that we have here. So the top two look at the breakdown of climate finance by mitigation and adaptation for the LDCs, and then on the right for the SIDS. So you can see for the LDCs, the mitigation is more of a stronger priority than for adaptation, and that dimension is probably more reflective of our wider member countries. But for the SIDS, it's almost a 50-50, which is it's good to see that we're getting that split in the portfolio and supporting SIDS to improve their resilience. Then on the lower two pie charts, we look at the sectors involved in adaptation for LDCs and SIDS. So for LDCs, the priority sectors for adaptation are urban water, agriculture and natural resources, and transport. Quite different focus or emphasis in the SIDS, where transport dominated at 60%. So that's support for investments on roads, bridges, ports, airports, and the second biggest was urban water. Agriculture, which was quite a big one for LDCs, quite small for the small island states. A final point on this graph is, it's been mentioned by a few others, and also throughout the last 2 weeks, is we had virtually no adaptation from private sector operations, and this is a phenomenon not limited to LDCs and SIDS. It was common throughout our portfolio. So it begs the question, how can we ramp up greater engagement with the private sector on adaptation? It's challenging, and I'll maybe make a couple of points on that towards the end. So next slide, please. Thank you. So just in terms of performance and results, just a few points. First thing is, we have quite a young portfolio. Our portfolio was from 2011 for a reason. That's when the MDBs started to tag projects with climate finance. So that's when we picked approvals from that date. So we have about 600 projects in the portfolio, but only 36 were approved, were completed and validated. And those that were validated are performing quite well. But to try and dig a bit deeper, we looked at a random sample of 250 projects to look at their design and those relevance issues associated with climate action. And what we found is that the results frameworks need strengthening, and in particular, in the case of recent approvals for adaptation projects, only a third had adaptation indicators at the outcome level in the results framework. So that is a concern. The other observation, which is maybe not unexpected, is that climate proofing infrastructure was mainly through structural measures. Not much of the portfolio over the 10 years focused on nature-based solutions, although we have seen a recent uptick in attention to that in a number of technical assistance support and through some policy-based lending. And maybe that's a nice segue into the next point. We did find that technical assistance and policy-based lending were really important and effective in enhancing member countries' capacity to manage climate risks and to put in place the necessary reforms at an institutional level to plan and bring in adaptation into national development plans. And then a final point on project beneficiaries. I mean, this is one thing we tried to do. We had 5 mission countries, and in each one we had a number of focus group discussions with beneficiaries. And I mean, the general feedback was quite positive in terms of their response to our investments. But most of them actually also highlighted the importance of context and community engagement when designing adaptation solutions. And if you can move to the next slide, just one more maybe example of, one of the challenges for evaluation is how do we measure the effectiveness of adaptation measures? And this is a challenge. And of course, it doesn't help if we don't have indicators in our results frameworks. But this was an interesting project in Bangladesh, one of our LDCs, where ADB had come in with KFW and with IFAD to support a range of communities. ADB's input was focusing on improving climate proofing rural roads and about 130 kilometers of rural roads. So what we did here is we looked at, we used satellite images using radar to look at flood inundation a week before, during, and after Cyclone Amphan, which occurred during May last year. And we had georeferenced road networks, and we used the radar to look at the extent of flood inundation just a week before and a week after. And these 3 images reflect 3 time slices. And at the end of the week after the typhoon, the cyclone, only one road stretch had evidence of inundation. So I think this is something that we need to do more of. We need to be more creative as evaluators to look at ways to assess how effective measures have been. So a final slide is on the key takeaways. So I think it's clear, improving resilience has to be a priority in these countries, and not just in terms of getting adaptation and resilience as a priority in the country strategies, but also in the programming, because we want this to influence the pipeline of projects in SIDS and LDCs. Second point is on technical assistance and policy-based lending to support adaptation. It is generating positive results both for planning and disaster risk reduction, and bringing in the necessary reforms in place and institutional capacity for member countries to manage these risks. The third point is about tracking climate outcomes. Climate finance accounting, and many of you will have seen this. Climate finance accounting is largely an ex-ante exercise, and we don't pay enough attention to what actually outcomes are being delivered on the ground. And one of the ways we can do that is to make sure that we get indicators in the results frameworks of these investments. And the second point is about devoting more attention to investments where adaptation is the primary objective. I think Andreas had a good word for it. He called them pure adaptation projects. which I think is, where we saw greater examples of that in ADB's portfolio was for during technical assistance and policy-based lending. I think we need to devote more attention to that share. And then the final point, I didn't really mention much about it, but I think it's because it's conspicuous in its absence in the portfolio, is the whole issue of the private sector. And what we're proposing here is to move up further upstream so that we can bring climate risk assessments into the private sector arena, but also for the public sector side of the institution to work more closely with the private sector side on the enabling environment. So these are the regulations, the laws, PPP laws, capacity standards, things like that to improve opportunities for private sector engagement. So I'll stop there, and during the panel, Nathan, and I'm happy to come back in again on questions. Thank you, thanks, Archie.
Thank you, Garrett. Thank you, Nathan, for those thoughts and some of those observations. Very important for us to. Nathan, did you want to come in now, or did you want to?
Let me just add a couple of things, right? I think, in this evaluation, we did a big climate evaluation this year. By the way, it's on the website. The full report is there for accessing. Last year, we also did a very big evaluation on ADB's energy policy. And so you can see in ADB, because the portfolio was heavily skewed towards mitigation, and much of the mitigation contributions were coming through the energy side. And so, these two evaluations together contributed to our efforts in terms of, how ADB can position itself in the future for addressing climate change. In the energy evaluation, ADB just recently, about a month ago, just before the COP, put out a new energy policy. And in that policy, they took in most of the recommendations that we had stated in that previous evaluation. And one of the key things that we had brought out in that evaluation was ADB should not use coal hereafter for power and or for heating. And that, as you guys can all imagine, was very controversial. But finally, ADB adopted that. And it was adopted as part of the new policy. And the other thing that we said was also pretty controversial is we said in terms of fossil fuel, including natural gas, we said there has to be a proper selection criteria before you deploy natural gas, because if there are alternative mechanisms for using renewable power, natural gas should not be used and there should be a proper screening criteria. And ADB has accepted that as well, although natural gas is something that they want to use as a bridge fuel, which is perfectly understandable, but then using specific screening criteria. Now, I'll make a couple of points. This is in addition, or leading on from what Garrett had already said, right, which is, starting 2014, ADB has for medium risk and high risk projects, ADB is requiring a climate risk assessment for every project. So the idea of a climate risk assessment is, you do a proper diagnostic and it informs the design of ADB's intervention for the future interventions. But unfortunately, in the evaluation, what we found out is the timing of the climate risk assessment is taking much longer. And by the time it is delivered, the project is already well designed. And so it's not informing the design of many of the projects. So we found a gap there and we put that out as a major finding in the evaluation. The other thing that we found was the climate risk assessment was of variable quality, right? Some cases it is very high standard, some cases it is not. And when we are talking about LDCs and SIDS, you can only imagine how important climate risk assessment is, because that's going to pretty much inform, for example, a SID, right? It's going to pretty much inform all future investments and huge amounts of capital that are going to go in. And so if you're going to have variable quality, that's going to have huge implications. And one of the things that we recommended in our report was a minimum threshold, a minimum standard for climate risk assessments. And that, I think, we should not only do it in ADB, we should do it across IFIs. We should somehow establish a minimum standard for climate risk assessments and say all of us use each other's climate risk assessments, and there should be a minimum threshold for it. And I think that will be highly transformational and useful. On the monitoring and evaluation side, right, Garrett alluded to this, right, which is in ADB, it's primarily an ex-ante exercise. They put in a lot of time and effort before approval, right, before taking the transaction to the board. But once the transaction is approved, there is very little time and effort put in on monitoring, building a good results framework to track it and report on it, and there is hardly anything done on ex post basis. So when evaluators come in to look at these transactions, right, that were done 7, 8 years ago, we rerun the economic return analysis, but hardly there is any exercise to go in and rerun the climate aspects of the project, right? So as a result, all these promises that were made at approval is never checked ex post, either in self-evaluation or on the validation that is done by us. So I think we flagged that as a major gap, because we cannot do it ourselves, because this is all dependent on data. They have to track it and collect it during the implementation and monitoring of these evaluations. So we found that there are gaps in the system, and it's all because climate has been moving so fast in the last decade. People have been reacting to it, and as a result, it's a huge unknown, right, as to how do you really track and report on this and measure it and be able to hold people accountable in terms of what they promised and what they're delivering. So I think that I see as a huge gap, and I don't know what you guys have seen in your institutions. Going forward, I think promises are easy, right? People have been promising net zero. Everybody is promising net zero by 2050, right? But the main thing is all this going to be achieved, and what is the track? What is the path? Because you should have a believable path, right, to 2050 to achieve net zero. And I think this trajectory is so important, and understanding and how these countries are progressing on that trajectory is very, very important. And that is something that I think maybe we all need to get together on and try to figure out how are we going to measure and come up with a harmonized approach. I don't know if we have harmonized indicators for adaptation, for example, right? There are various types of adaptation projects. There is no proper toolkit in terms of what are the harmonized indicators that all of us can use. What are some of the baselines that are there so that people don't have to reinvent the wheel? I think these are all the things that we sort of alluded to in our evaluation, and I think those will all go a long way in helping, especially the LDCs and the SITs, because Andres, you pointed out that it's not coming in time and that it's taking longer and huge levels of capacity is needed. I think if we can do some of this groundwork, on a foundational basis that's available for everybody, then I think that will help cut down on time, and all of us can probably improve quality. So let me stop there. I can come back in terms of some of the other challenges and constraints that we face, especially on the private sector side, right? On the private sector side, I'll throw in a couple of points, right? With LDCs, on the energy evaluation, we pointed out a couple of glaring misses, right? One is on the demand side energy efficiency, right? This is, ADB has been primarily working on transmission and distribution lines, right? That is the big chunk of their portfolio, which is heavy infrastructure investments. They go in, and the rationale for those investments is, we're going to reduce losses in transmission, right? Yeah, there is benefit to that, right? You are reducing losses, but then you can have a much higher impact if you're going to do the last mile in terms of, just before the beneficiary receives the power, if you can reduce losses there, which is where maximum amount of losses happen, and there is no proper metering, and there is no proper incentive mechanisms in place so that people are using the required amount of power and not abusing it. So all that ADB doesn't do enough of. And the other area that we pointed out was, on the demand side energy efficiency in terms of retrofitting buildings to make them much more efficient. Help coming up with better, AC systems and so on that run much more efficient, right? And one example that we pointed out was got to do with cooking stoves, right? In LDCs and in India too, right? Many of the rural communities, they use firewood for cooking, right? And it causes a lot of problems. It causes health issues for people inside the house because there is so much smoke inside the house, and they're cutting down forests for firewood. And there is a very easy solution for this. You can have cooking stoves that are highly efficient, use very little power, and you can have a number of co-benefits from this. But those are all the projects that are not being done. And the reason it's not being done is because it's very distributed, and there are so many beneficiaries, and it's much harder to do. Whereas ADB wants to be involved in this big infrastructure projects with one counterpart, and so you can easily control the timeline of these projects and meet the budgets. So I think incentives and laying the groundwork and coming up with out-of-the-box thinking that can have a lot of co-benefits can go a long way. On the private sector side, I think the policy and intervention has to go hand in hand. Case in point is in the SIDS, right? In the SIDS, you have to come up with distributed solutions, right? For renewable energy, like rooftop solar. Coming up with a solar plant is probably, it helps, may not be the right solution because the markets are very, very shallow. There is not need for a lot of power. So what you need is a rooftop solar. And for that, you need net metering, and you need to have a proper policy so that people can exchange power, right, as and when they need it, and the excess power can be returned back to the grid. And for that, you need a proper policy, regulatory framework, and a good enforcement mechanism. And that is not there. And I think that's where, the SIDS and the LDCs are suffering, right? Because I think they need huge capacity, out-of-the-box thinking to help them. And sometimes many of the IFIs are set up to deal with bigger clients and big infrastructure projects and quick turnarounds. So I think these are some of the challenges that we saw. These are some of the big lessons that we see. Ownership is a big problem with LDCs and SIDS. There's constant turnover, right? Because the institutions are not advanced and the governance mechanisms are not there. Every time there's a change in counterpart, it's, you have to train them all over again. Whereas in a more advanced economy, you have really developed institutions. So the government can change, but the institutions are there to continue on. That is not there. And all our TAs, right, are all grant-based, right? We don't have reimbursable TAs. And our TA amount in our evaluation, we point out, is grant money. It's hard to come by, right? But they're on a declining trend. Whereas this is a time when all the LDCs and SIDS need more TA assistance. And they are unwilling to pay for this TA because they look at this TA and say, oh, let me compare how much I have to pay for this versus a consulting company from whom I can get the same service. And what is the quality that you provide versus what the consulting service provides. So there are all these complex issues that arise in terms of reimbursable TAs, and I think that's a nut that we have to crack as well in terms of over the long term, how are we going to provide this capacity building support? And that has to be through reimbursable TAs. It cannot be fully grant funded because we can never mobilize the level of money that is needed. So it has to be an advisory solution. And for that, the advice has to be valued. And that goes back to the skill set, right? And because you don't want generalists in the bank, you want people that are experts in this, and they are refining those tools along the way. So, I'll stop there. Just to provide a little bit more granularity on, the wonderful things that Garrett already covered. So, back to you, Archie.
Thank you, Garrett. Thank you, Nathan. Those are some very, very, very important insights about we need to think about not just where we're investing, but the ways in which these investments are made and the support is provided. The journey, it's not just the direction of travel, it's how we do the travel, who we take along, by what means we travel, and do we leave some people behind, and at what speed we travel. All of those qualitative indicators are as important as anything, although as we found in Alexandra's case, qualitative studies we can't include in the EGM, and there might be lessons learned from that. So I'll urge our panel members to keep thinking about those some of those things. What are the things that you're thinking about private sector and access and balancing adaptation, and the challenge of the two institutions we've heard from are finding it a challenge to balance adaptation and mitigation. But before we do that, and before we turn to the audience to ask for some of them to share their experiences and challenges in adaptation in the SIDS and LDCs, let me turn to our last speaker from the panel. Mr. Timo Letter is a researcher at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment, the GRI, London School of Economics and Political Science. He's the lead author of the 6th Adaptation Gap Report of the UNEP, which was launched here last week. So that's one thing that that we're really excited to hear his reflections on. But he's also been involved with the IPCC as IPCC 6th Assessment Report. He's also been worked as a lead author of the UNEP's Adaptation Gap Report on various previous iterations of it. And they've just launched their report last week, and again, coming back to the science, we've heard from evaluators after Alexandra, we've heard from the evaluators. take us back to the science and tell us what you guys are finding, and what's been your reflection over the 2 weeks here at the COP.
Yeah, thank you, Archie. Thank you very much for having me. And in fact, I want to bring us back to COP26, where we are here, and put this discussion into perspective. I mean, we have seen this week record numbers of commitments to adaptation finance. The European Commission gave 100 million to the Adaptation Fund, which is the single largest ever contribution to the Adaptation Fund. We have seen the Adaptation Fund's board's request for finance was met more than 3 times over. So we see all this finance coming now on adaptation, but the point is, can we design the projects in a way that are effective and meet the results? And some of what we've heard from the previous speakers and from the very important evaluation work that your units are doing, 1/3 of the projects not even having any adaptation outcome indicators. I think this was a finding not just mentioned in what was by ADB, but also by the GCF's independent evaluation unit. Frankly, these results are shocking. I mean, we cannot spend hundreds of millions on adaptation and assume they will deliver, adaptation results if we don't measure them at all. I think the finding from the GCF independent evaluation unit said 50% of the results of the series of change don't even explain how you're achieving adaptation. So then how can we expect that this finance is going to make a difference? And therefore this discussion today is absolutely timely. So I just wanted to make this statement up front, why this is so important. As one of the lead authors of the Adaptation Gap Report, so I lead on the implementation chapter of the report. This is UNEP's flagship report looking at the state of adaptation globally. We have 3 core chapters, finance, planning and implementation, looking at what progress are we making globally. In the implementation chapter, we are looking, of course, at projects by multilateral and bilateral donors and other sources of evidence, but it's really hard to find information on the results. Yeah? So it's easy to say, okay, we've got X number of projects. So in fact, we found almost 3,000 adaptation projects in total over the last 10 years. Funded by multilateral and bilateral donors, but it's very hard to find information. Okay, what was the result? What was the effect of all these projects? And this is what we have to change. I'm very well aware of the difficulties of assessing adaptation, having been doing research over this over the last 10 years. But this is where we need to improve. So what I wanted to share with you today is basically 2 things, findings from the Adaptation Gap Report, and from another interesting initiative, which is similar to what Alexandra has shown in her evidence map. So I'm also involved in a global research collaboration called the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative, which is looking at evidence of adaptation having taken place and possibly evidence of the results of them. Our results were published very timely again last week in the journal Nature Climate Change. It's even on the cover of Nature Climate Change. So what we've been doing is we looked at evidence in the literature for adaptation having been implemented. So if you look into the scientific literature on adaptation, there are tens of thousands of studies, but more than 90% are focusing on before implementation is actually getting implemented. So it's looking at vulnerability assessment, capacity assessment, potential options for adaptation, but there's very little evidence of adaptation having taken place, and even fewer of adaptation having resulted in risk reduction. So to give you the numbers, I think we found 48,000 articles which are somewhat related to adaptation. Of those, 1,700 documented that adaptation had taken place, and of these, only 2% had primary quantitative evidence or qualitative evidence of risks having been reduced. So again, 48,000, then 1,700, and only 2% of those having shown this risk reduction. Of course, this doesn't mean that out of the other 98% that it didn't have an impact, but it wasn't documented, it wasn't proven, if you want, or there was no clear results on that. And this, the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative time period was from 2013 to 2019. So that's an interesting finding, and that is also one of the data sources in the Adaptation Gap Report in the implementation chapter, together with insights, for example, from the evaluations that we've heard about. So I wanted to stress again how important this work is, because we need the synthesis as a lead author on this chapter. I depend on the synthesis findings from your units and organizations to see what worked, what didn't work, and where do we stand. So thank you for the work you've been doing so far. Yeah, what else did I want to say? Bringing us also to the national level, this was mentioned. So evaluations are not only important for adaptation projects, but also for adaptation policies at the national level. Countries are doing national adaptation plans, and I've recently completed a global stocktake of the M&E systems of these national adaptation plans. And by now, 15 countries have published evaluations of their national adaptation policies, which is good. It's a 40% increase over 2017. And more SIDS and LDCs have done so recently, publishing progress reports on their national adaptation policies. And this is so important because by now 70 or 80 countries have detailed adaptation policies or plans, but the question is, are these getting implemented? And my research found that in 60% of the cases there's no evidence for any tracking of the implementation of these policies. So that's another major gap. And the importance here is that if we use the indicator globally, as in the SDGs, under SDG 13, one of the indicators is number of countries with a plan. But this doesn't say anything about the implementation of that plan. So that's another very important finding. I think these are some of the flagship things I wanted to share. And I think that's what I will be leaving us with, and happy to go further into the discussion. Last point maybe being that under the negotiations, the global stocktake on adaptation is taking place 2023. Next year the Secretariat is preparing the synthesis report on that, and we need exactly this information from your funds, independent evaluation units, to inform this as well, because otherwise there would only be country submissions, which is an important source of input, but it cannot be the only source, because if you want to learn from implementation, we have to look at what happens and taking this information on board. Happy to discuss more. Thank you very much for having me and for this event today. Thank you.
Thank you, Timo. We've heard from those who are watching online. You can't see me because I've left my chair and I'm moving into the audience to ask the audience if we might have questions for the speakers, or if we want to share lessons from our own experiences. I can see there's some parties in the room, there's researchers in the room. If there's experiences with drafting or developing national strategies on adaptation and or other lessons that you'd like to share, or questions that you might want to ask the panel.
Oh, sorry, is it audible? Oh, yes, sorry. Hi again. I guess we have some new people around. My name is Amber, and I work with the Center for Environmental Peace Building. And yeah, I have a question or just kind of some ideas to hear what the panel thinks. I think there are a lot of NGOs and research organizations out there that do have additional capacity to help support the drafting of applications for climate finance adaptation projects. And it sounds like from what you shared today that there really is a need, especially among some of the small island developing states. And I think one of the big challenges for us who are not necessarily quite as well connected to the process, smaller organizations and what have you, is really learning what those requirements are and sort of what are the processes for just the different steps that you have to go through to certify and to provide support in filling these applications. And so one idea that came to mind is that I've heard so many people speak during the COP about climate adaptation finance and innovative mechanisms and what many different groups are doing. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on kind of what we can do as civil society groups in connecting with groups such as the Green Climate Fund, GIZ, and other larger organizations on really learning how to, after the COP, how to fill these applications and how to really build our own internal capacity to provide support where it's needed. If you have any ideas or thoughts on that, that would be really lovely to hear. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amber. That actually addresses a question that we should talk about also on data. That's one of the things we've not spoken about yet in terms of access. And I'll turn maybe perhaps to the colleagues from GCF to talk about that in just a second. I also want to request Nathan and Garrett to tell us a little bit about the advocacy, because you've made some very, and I'll come to you in just a second after the GCF, Nathan and Garrett. You've made some very startling, for an independent valuation unit, for a department such as yours, quite strong recommendations focusing on the portfolio of the ADB and particularly investments in fossil fuels and coal, and how you went about doing advocacy for that. But first, to colleagues at the GCF about access to climate finance, and particularly focusing on data. Andres and Victoria in that order, or Victoria and Andres in that order. Victoria, could you also tell us about the SAP portfolio as well? The simplified approval process of the GCF, which is supposed to focus on be a simplified process for access to climate finance. And Victoria was a part of the evaluation of that, and what lessons we might be able to draw from the evaluation of that process.
Yeah, so these are two, I would say, very overlapping questions, Archie, on the data and on different modalities, including SAP to access the finance, right? So GCF is trying a lot of ways to simplify the process of accessing the climate finance to countries with different capacities. So specifically for the countries with lower capacity, and I mean, I'm talking about the human capacity, technological capacity, institutional capacity. There is a separate simplified modality, that allows the lower climate risks projects and to speed up the approval process. However, what we are observing, well, in the context of LDC countries and SIDS, what we are observing actually that these modalities are not working well, and they actually take more time to be processed rather than the regular approval process. And in terms of data that is required for both simplified and the regular approval processes, what we are observing is that GCF has this approach, one size fits all, and different countries with different capacities face the same data requirements. And this is something that has been mentioned in multiple speeches, that many LDCs do not have actually data collection systems in place to provide this level of detail or granularity to make a strong project proposal, and which actually, just extend the time of the project approval, but is not really incorporated in the results framework. Yes, so these are our main messages on these two aspects.
Thanks, Victoria. Andres, any insights from your end in terms of the recommendations you're making related to data and or other recommendations that you might have from the SIDS evaluation?
Yeah, thanks, Archie, and thanks, colleagues, for the really valid point. I mean, let me scale back and say a few things on the general question of access and data and access, particularly from NGOs, from the NGOs' perspective, from the wider civil society. It is obviously the GCF has this mandate and this principle to be country-driven and country-owned. And we've done, in 2019, an evaluation on the country ownership principle of the GCF. And what we found back then was that often country ownership gets translated into country government ownership. So it's this question of how can we ensure that processes in climate finance are far more inclusive. Inclusive in the way that they not only look at beneficiary groups that are vulnerable groups, that are groups that truly face the effects of climate change, but also truly in need of action interventions, but also to look into this question of how can we create within the country and in the different developing countries that we're serving a system for effective and efficient climate action management. And what we found there, it is truly a gap within the GCF to allow this joint co-creation and co-development of climate action in the countries. In particular, when we look at the engagement of stakeholders. And the GCF as an institution has said it will set out guidelines for effective engagement with stakeholders in the countries. These guidelines were supposed to be revised and haven't been. But we would, even from the evaluation unit, go one step further and say, despite that and beyond that, we would really need a stakeholder engagement policy. A policy that truly pushes the countries and not only the countries, let me be frank, also the accredited entities, such as ADB and others, to come to the table and truly discuss how can we push forward the agendas and the needs that we have in the countries. And that relates very much to Timo's question on, countries obviously are coming forward with their needs and their plans, and plans are good. And national adaptation plans are important. But what it needs is, it needs from the country's perspective not only the plans to do something, it also needs a financial plan, an investment plan to truly understand how are we going to finance this. And if we continue to say these are the needs and these are the plans on how to address the needs, we're forgetting about the aspect of and how are we looking at finance. And here I come again to this aspect that I was highlighting before with this coherence and complementarity question, the coordination at country level that is truly needed. Now, switching to data, and data needs were really already addressed by Victoria, so I won't spend much time on it. But what we found as well is this question of how can we ensure that we have data systems in place to address the data needs that organizations such as the GCF and the ADB need. Other organizations need as well, talking about the UNEP gap report and the global adaptation mapping initiative, to better understand of how far have we come with our work. And this requires a couple of things. We need to look at how can we help projects and projects teams to think actively, not only ex ante and then never think about it again, but actively throughout the implementation of projects about how can we learn and how can we ensure that we have the data needs addressed. So we are learning, we're collecting data in a way that it's robust and evidence-based and strong. So we can also for the future share this learning and create that knowledge knowledge management and the knowledge sharing that we need in the future for other countries to learn with us on what has worked and what didn't work in different countries. So I'm trying to give you a broader aspect here as well, because I really like what Alexandra has shown. Evidence gap maps are true first steps for evaluations as well. They are a precursor to evaluations. We have used that evidence gap maps as it was co-produced with DeVal together as well for our evaluation to better understand where do we have the knowledge? Are we investing in these areas of knowledge? Or are we then thinking about investing in the areas where we don't have any knowledge to say, okay, now we're going into evidence scarce area to build that knowledge for the future and so to build more robust projects for impact. So that's a little bit on a take on that. And finally, there are obviously these questions of access and accreditation. Have been difficult. We have also done an accreditation synthesis that highlighted some of these aspects to say that it takes a very long time to get accredited. We have found on average for international as well as direct access entities, on average it takes 1100 days to be accredited. That's an awful long time. So sometimes it might not be the best way forward to be accredited, certified as you said, because projects are managed by the accredited entities, but the implementation happens with everyone else that is also a stakeholder of the ecosystem. That means the executing entities, but also the other organizations on the ground. And here I come to the very final point I wanted to make. Private sector, sometimes, as I said, we don't understand the complexion of the private sector or the context of a private sector. And even the firm that is building the infrastructure that we're looking at when we looked at ADB's portfolio, this is also a private sector. So this is not only the finance part that is the private sector, there are other parts to private sector too, like the real private sector that would actually help to implement some of these projects. So again, for an NGO it might not be necessarily the best way forward to get accreditation, but there are many other ways to be involved. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Andres. Thanks, Victoria. I want to turn to colleagues at the ADB, but before that, a question that is just to get Timo and Alexandra to get us thinking about. I'll come to you after the ADB colleagues, but could you tell us when we come to you a little bit later about the blind spots in the literature? Andres has spoken about areas we might not know about, but Alexandra, Timo, there's lots of biases, generally speaking, in the literature, especially related to language, publication, etc. And I want to ask you about that in a second, but before that, let me turn to Nathan and to Garrett about advocacy for the evidence and how we make changes happen in our respective institutions and their policies.
Yeah. Let me take a crack at that, right? So I think, so we are the independent evaluations department, right? So we report directly to the board of ADB through the Director General of our department. So in that sense, we are free from conflicts and we are free from any bias. And so, we can make really objective evaluations. And so what we have done is there are some guiding principles in terms of how we select topics for evaluation, how we go about doing these evaluations. Right? In terms of selecting topics for evaluation, we have a rolling 3-year work program. So we have, broad-based communication with the senior management, with the board, and we come up with what are some of the gaps in the bank in terms of knowledge and in terms of better understanding that needs to happen where we can be useful. Right? At the end of the day, we have to be useful because the evaluation has to be used. It's an important learning tool. So we come up with that, and then we try to come up with topics for evaluation for the next 3 years. But in doing so, what we do is, what are these topics? How are they going to feed into what is the next thing that the bank is doing? For example, we decided to do the energy evaluation because ADB was thinking about revising its energy policy. The prior energy policy was done in 2009 and it was coming up for renewal, and we thought, okay, all right, we have to do a review of not only the policy but the program that was influenced by the policy for the last decade, and so we can tell ADB and the board what has worked, what has not worked, and what should be the new policy going forward. So in that sense, we align our timing very close to what ADB is trying to do. This climate evaluation, we worked very, very hard to make sure it's coming before the COP, right? So we took it to the board in October of this year. So we wanted to make sure that as ADB and the rest of the world was preparing for the COP, we wanted to put out this evaluation and give a quick update on where ADB has stood in terms of its approach to climate and in performance and results in climate. So that is the first way we try to make ourselves really relevant, right? That's one. Second is, during the evaluation itself, we triangulate and we talk to all kinds of stakeholders, right? Internal and external. We talk to centers of excellence. We go to all the countries. We have country case studies. We get data at the country case study level. So we try to get as granular as possible and with all different, at the community level, at the IAs and the EA level, at the government, and then private sector. We go to the chambers of commerce. So we try to reach different entities at the country and at the operational level to get feedback, right? And we also have very close collaboration with management all along the way to come up with this. And ultimately, at the end, when we come up with the conclusions and the recommendations, we want to make sure that we, over the years, this is still work in progress. But this is something that we try to do is we want to come out with really actionable recommendations. We don't want to come out with recommendations that are pie in the sky, that are very generic, that has already been said before. We don't want to do that. We have been trying very hard to come up with recommendations that are incremental, that are actionable, and that are based on what we found in the evaluation. So we don't come up with recommendations that are, really out there and, people all know about this, needs to be done, but is not informed by the evaluation. So we already make the link. We have a table in all our evaluations where we link the findings to issues to recommendations. So because the findings can be negative or positive, we relate all the negative findings as issues, and from the issues we translate them into recommendations, and we say these are the important things that the bank has to act on. So these are some of the things that we have done to improve the quality of our evaluations. And in the last 4 or 5 years, what we have also done is to outreach all our evaluations, right? Both internally and externally, in various different forums, right? And that's why we were so excited when you guys gave us the opportunity to outreach our climate evaluation and also to the Korean pavilion to inviting us. So because we want to outreach it as much as possible, because we don't want it to sit in the shelf. We want this to be useful, and so I think that those are some of the things that we have been doing to advocate for change, and we try our best to make sure that we're coming out with messages that are readily useful, immediately of value to the bank and to the board, right? So that's how we have done it, and we have come out, in the last few years, we have done evaluations on all of ADB's transport program, all of ADB's energy program. We did one on agriculture and natural resources of ADB. We did climate. We did one on PPPs. So, we pick all these topics that are in the news and try to come up with, granular recommendations. But to cap it all, I would say the biggest lesson that I have learned is, outreaching it and making the knowledge available and discussing and, getting feedback from all the others is as important as doing the evaluation itself. And I think, that is very important for us as evaluators to take on, because otherwise your evaluation is never going to get used. I think we have to make sure that is what we're doing. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that Archie addresses a little bit of how we are trying to advocate for our evaluations, both internally and externally. And for each evaluation, we go to the board and we have a face-to-face discussion for 2 to 3 hours with management by the side, and it's us and management and the board. And we have this free-flowing discussion, so management can come back to us, pick on any topic that we have covered in the evaluation and say, why are you saying this? And so they can question us. So that is the level of scrutiny that we go through in these evaluations. And we publish the whole thing. As soon as it's done, we publish it as well. So those are all the underlying things that we have done to make sure that it's useful, and we hold ourselves to the highest quality that we can subject ourselves to. So.
Maybe, Archie, if I could just come in very briefly just to supplement. Just one point on data, and then Amber's question on civil society. On data, I think Alexandra and Timo mentioned, that the gold standard is impact evaluation, but we rarely do impact evaluations. They're quite expensive. I mean, I was involved in the last one we did in IAD, and it was great. It was actually a pleasure to be involved in something where you gathered such strong data set. So the question is, what do we do in projects, our more routine projects where we don't have the luxury of collecting impact level, rigorous impact evaluations? So, I mean, it gets back to our results frameworks and, designing them in a way that we can actually measure how effective various adaptation approaches have been. On Amber's point on civil society and an NGO, I mean, from an evaluation perspective, they're a key informant, and actually they're really important for us to engage with in our country missions to better understand how government policies have been implemented and communities. And then from the operations side, and I suppose this is maybe the strongest entry point for engagement of civil society and NGOs, is actually to support projects in supporting the communities to better design projects, adaptation projects that get the context right, and to engage with the community so that avoid maladaptation. So I think there are 2 entry points that we've seen that are really important for both the evaluation side and the operation side. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you both, Nathan and Garrett. Very important things to think about in terms of entry points and advocacy and getting your findings out. And at this, so Alexandra, first over to you, and Timo, then to you. Are the scientists getting their studies out? What are the kinds of biases we're looking at in the literature?
Sorry, Archie, I do have some difficulties in understanding you. Perhaps there is a issue with my internet connection. Could you please
we can hear you quite well, Alexandra. We can hear you quite well, even if you can't hear us.
I have a difficulty with your microphone, but perhaps you could try once more, or use Andreas' microphone.
Let me try this microphone. Perhaps you can hear me better now. Is this better?
Yeah, let's have a try.
Okay. So turning very quickly then to the biases in the literature, what are the kinds of biases we would expect in your review of this literature of the evidence gap map? And then B, how do we address some of those biases when we take the results of these EGM such as this? What are the kinds of things to be aware of when we take them to the decision makers?
I hope I understood you correctly about the biases in the EGM and how to address those. Okay, thank you very much. So, sorry, I don't know why there is an issue with the internet connection, but I hope I got it fully. So this is also to answer a bit on Garrett's point on the gold standards, that impact evaluations is very costly, and I do agree on this. And we saw, for example, in the evidence gap map that there's surprisingly little evidence in the water sector, for example, as for example, interventions do tend to be of long time horizons. So the bias could be the type of studies we selected. You cannot always do the gold standard, but knowing this, there might be an option to further consider new types of evidence, for example, qualitative evidence. Although this is much more tricky, you need to define and set criteria of what actually good qualitative evidence, for example, is. But I think this is a need to further orient policy making and also to avoid maladaptation. And coming to further biases, for example, we found that there is a lot of, we considered, due to our resources, English-speaking evidence or articles which do at least have an abstract in English. So there's a lot of evidence, roughly 40%, I think, from Sub-Saharan Africa, and which has a bias, since a lot of evidence from the Caribbean, from Latin America, is published, for example, in Spanish. So there needs to be further languages included, and the global evidence initiatives need also to consider those studies and evidences. Well, and I think this is easily feasible since the protocol we used is so standardized or so systematic. You can just use it and do further research in other languages. Yeah. And well, finally, also to mention that studies were just considered until 2018, but we are already in the year 2021, and the body of evidence is growing quickly, especially in the adaptation world. So I think there is a bias, and I would call for more contribution to global learning partnerships, for global evidence partnerships, in order to address and to consider quickly growing evidence bodies. Thank you very much, Ati.
Absolutely, Alexandra. In fact, although they're not strictly part of the peer-reviewed literature, but at least the evaluations that we've spoken about, both the ADB'S and the GCFs, would not have been done in 2018 and are very recent and contribute to very significantly to what we know about the portfolios. Timo, over to you. We've been speaking about many different things here. Any comments on and reflections on other speakers' interventions and or biases in the literature?
Lots of comments, but if I speak just on the biases in literature, so the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative's findings, that there's kind of a bar chart picture which shows how many publications there are per geographic region and per sector or per addressed hazard. And for the Pacific region, there have been the fewest number of publications, whereas most are from Africa and Asia. So there's already a lower evidence base, if you want. There's, of course, some sort of bias. Not everything gets published in academic journals, right? Which is clear. There's also some sort of language bias. Also, In the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative, we had an author team of 120 people, so we did not limit it to English. We had Spanish abstracts, French abstracts, and so on. But most of the indexed journals in the Web of Science are, of course, English, so that's the bias. But the key point is, therefore, this is only one source that we are relying on. So in the Adaptation Gap Report in the implementation chapter, this is one of 3 data inputs. And if we combine them, then we can kind of compensate for the weaknesses or for the blind spots of the others. And that's the idea, that overall we can kind of get this mosaic of different data sources and information to best understand the global picture on adaptation. That is also what the IPCC Working Group 2 report, which comes out next year in February, to which I've also contributed, will be discussing. There are many more comments I could make, but that was your main question. Should I? Or? Please. Okay. Then I was on the gold standard. So of course we cannot always do a randomized control trial. It's way too time-consuming, way too expensive. GIZ, Germany's development agency, which Alexandra and I used to work at, has also published a position paper in this. And many of the projects from GIZ are in fact capacity building projects also at the national level, for example supporting the Ministry of Energy on developing the energy policy. So you don't have a control group because the sample size is 1. In this country you've got 1, so you couldn't do it, right? And of course it's very expensive and very time consuming. We need and in addition, speaking of the capacity limits in SITs, it is often better to have a more pragmatic approach. Like if you simply do workshops with those who were involved, asking them what worked and what didn't work. It gets you all a very rich data source. It doesn't cost much, but you can still learn from it and improve as kind of real-time improvement. That's what we need. So we don't need RCTs for everything. Also, in terms of indicators for adaptation, the most important part are not indicators but the theory of change. To get right, what does adaptation look like? To have a joint understanding of particular projects, the how question, I keep stressing this. It's not the country ownership. Country ownership is relatively easy because most of the NDCs cover basically every sector on adaptation. It's very hard not to align with those policies, right? So it's not the ownership. Also, most of you bilateral funds, of course, need the letter from the government to even get the approval. So it should basically be an exclusion criterion, but not an evaluation criterion. Because if you had funded something which is not relevant, it shouldn't have been funded in the first place. So the theory of change and adaptation, that is so important. If you get this right, and if you can then find different data sources, can be indicators, can be qualitative information, that's fine. But so it's not just the indicators. And this is very important to keep in mind. For example, the World Bank has now the resilience rating system. And one of the indicators they use to determine if a project is improving resilience is whether there is an indicator on adaptation. But if having one single indicator, which isn't even necessarily indicating adaptation, even if it's called an adaptation indicator, is not a sufficient indicator to say that the project will be resilient, right? So, so we have to have higher standards than that, and there's lots to do. But yeah, so much for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Timo. Colleagues, are there any, before we close, and we're about to close in a couple of minutes, any other reflections from any of the panelists or members of the audience? Please unmute yourselves if you're on the panel, or just raise your hand and I'll run to you with the mic.
Richie, Archie, maybe just one point, kind of to follow up on Timo's point. I mean, I totally agree on the theory of change. And there are on the evaluation side, I think there are devices that can help us. And we're evaluators, so we evaluate completion reports. And there's one institution which I think been quite good on adaptation is IFAD. And one way they've helped structure and sort of reinforce the need to think about and address adaptation in their completion reports is it's one of the evaluation criteria. I think it's one of the few multilaterals that actually has, as well as our relevance, effectiveness, efficiency and sustainability, they have some below the line criteria, and one of them is on adaptation. And I think if nothing else, it forces the project officer to review its project, consider the adaptation efforts, and then obviously from the evaluator's point of view, we have material to evaluate in a more structured way. So that's just one observation that came across. Thank you.
if I on the theory of change, right? Timo talked about. I think it's a really good point that the strength of the theory of change is absolutely critical for climate change investments. I think people are very clear about the inputs and the outputs.
Yes.
It's about the link from the output to the outcome, and what can, in a realistic sense, this output can lead to which outcome in what context, is what people struggle with. And I think there are exaggerations that are being made at the inception stage in terms of what an output can deliver in terms of an outcome. And I think some realism there based on theory of change that is already well articulated for a sector, for a country, would be really useful for investment offices at the planning stages. So I think that is something that we are constantly trying in ADB to make sure that every intervention comes with a theory of change. This is still work in progress. We introduced it in evaluations in the last 5 years, and we do it as part of approach now for every evaluation. We construct our own theory of change before we do any evaluation. And we are requiring this now for big programs, and we are saying ADB should move in that direction. On a more broader sense, I just want to make this point, right? As IFIs, we all have supposedly the loudspeakers, right? The convening power to be able to bring different authorities and investors to the table and influence public opinion. We have all talked about in this session on what the SIDS are facing, right? The SIDS haven't committed much of any grave error in terms of emissions, but they are facing the brunt of climate change. They are all going to be, facing, with no action, they will all be flooded, and their existence will be gone, right? So I think anything that we can do to prioritize action on SIDS, because there is various different actions that are being put out for climate change, but there is no concerted effort to say SIDS need to be addressed first and foremost. We need to mobilize money from different sources, because it's going to cost billions of dollars for adaptation efforts in SIDS, right? Because these are structural solutions, and these are going to cost billions, and no one party can address it. And I think we as IFIs, if we can all mobilize together, use our convening power, and create public opinion to prioritize action on SIDS as the first thing that needs to happen, and I think that would be highly transformational. I think maybe that's something that I want to put out there as something that we all can collaborate and cooperate and put out for action on SIDS. That'll be beneficial to them. So, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Garrett. Thank you, Nathan. Any other quick reflections before we come to a close for this event? Nathan, what you said was very important. It's not just we started with a discussion on what we know, what we don't know, but it's also very important to think about what, once we know what we don't know, what we know, to then put that into action. And how we do that is also very important. The responsibility doesn't end by doing our respective studies, and we've spoken about advocacy of this. And the reason why we're all here is because we want to talk about the respective things that we found, and just want to take them ahead. I also want to. There's another note that I listened to all of you, and one other thing that's noticeable is that we are where we are. We wouldn't have been here 2 years ago. We are already advancing and pushing the frontiers of knowledge quite significantly. We've spoken about a number of issues from the private sector: limited access to data, limited access of SIDS and LDCs to climate finance, access to data in these countries, the balance in portfolios, the importance of advocacy, the importance of what counts as adaptation, context, planning, national planning. All of these things are there are limitations in how effective we are as a civilization in all of these. But being in this panel and now listening to all of you, I know that we know a lot. There are a lot more known unknowns than there must have been a while ago. So that's good news. And with that lesson, we could probably draw to a close on this session. And hopefully, before the conclusion of the COP, we'll get good news from here also on the various parts of adaptation and finance that this COP is considering. Thank you so much, members of the panel. Thank you so much, audience members who are here and who are those who are online or watching later, as you might, for this very, very informative and rich session. And hopefully you'll have good news if you're watching us later before the end of the COP. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the COP, and wish you a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. That was great.
Bye.